Hey there, YouTube family. Welcome back to a brand new hour-long painting lesson. Today, we're going to be painting the Earth out in space, and this is going to be a really fun one. I've wanted to do an hour-long space scene for really the longest time, and I've done a couple nice Starry Night sky pieces up over on Patreon, but never anything truly from the perspective of space. So that is what we are tackling here today. I'm really excited to see how it turns out, and I suppose you already have. You've seen the thumbnail, but let's have some fun and let's explore this together. So, as per usual, I'm going to quickly talk about the materials before we begin, and then we'll hop into that painting portion. Now, this of course is in real time, and it's uncut with the exception of when I need to clean my water or my palette. So, with that said, here I have a 9 by 12 inch canvas. The drawing is already done on there. It was done with these woodless colored pencils. I like these a lot because they help me allocate different colors to different subjects. So here I have my grid, it's done in a red. The earth is done in a blue. Here I have some land masses kind of in a green. It's also great because it's relatively erasable and it doesn't dilute pigment like a charcoal or graphite might. Also, in regards to the drawing, if you'd like help with the drawing process, there is the traceable and reference photo up over on Patreon to, again, just help you get into that painting process, not to worry too much about creating all of that line work from watching the video. But on the note of Patreon, for those of you who are new and unaware, Patreon's a great way to support the channel, to say thank you, but it's also a great way to get plenty of extra bonus rewards. An example, all of those Starry Night sky pieces we just talked about, they are up there. There's a back catalog of over 50 exclusive hour-long lessons, and it's ever growing, so new ones are added here and there as well. I'd also like to note that I just added a new ebook over at the Alpine level. It is 21 traceables and reference photos of flowers for those uninspired days when you really want to make something, but the ideas just aren't coming. We also have an exclusive Facebook group for everyone to kind of share their work, help out, and it's also a great way for me to see your work and help wherever I can. There are also some fun things like polls and also traceables for all of the new hour-long lessons added here on YouTube each and every week. So if that interests you at all, go check it out. There is a link in the description. With that, let's get back to the materials. So here I have a small dish which will be filled with water. This is going to be used to clean my brushes, to also help me condense the bristles of my brushes, and to extend the wet life of my paint, but we'll talk about all of that in the lesson. Here I have a small painting cloth. This is to wipe off my excess water and my excess paint. Here I have a picture frame, which I'm actually using as a palette. I like it a lot because it's fairly easy to clean and none of the paint kind of absorbs into it. So from there, let's talk about brushes. Here I have a larger flat-headed brush, and this has a 2 centimeter width right here, and I like this a lot for working on larger areas of the canvas and for sharp areas because this can work really well in delivering a clean line. Then I move on to my medium-sized flat-headed brush. This one is only 1 centimeter wide, so it's half, but it'll let me work in slightly more detailed areas. Then for the really finite details, I have this smaller flat-headed brush. It is only half a centimeter wide, but it's really fantastic when you need to create the smallest of implications. Then I have a medium-sized round-headed brush. This one is great for creating softer edges. It doesn't actually have a hard edge itself, so it's really nice for those soft blends. For the detailed soft blends, I just have a smaller version of it like that. So that's all very simple, very easy. I'm only going to be using 5 brushes, and that's really all you need. So with that, let's talk about paints. Now, you see the thumbnail, you know this turns into a fairly vibrant painting, but I'm going to begin by painting a base layer with the achromatic palette, and that is simply black, white, and gray. So here I have Mars black, here I have titanium white. I will mix my grays out of that, but we essentially create a base layer with black, white, and gray because it allows us to simply think about value and depth, nothing else. So when you are creating depth in a painting, you're essentially wrapping light around a subject. So areas are going to be brighter, areas are going to be darker, and it's much easier to gauge that when you're only thinking about the grayscale because you don't have to think about colors. A lot of us have a lot of preconceived notions about which colors are bright, which colors are dark, and in all honesty, every color essentially has a wide range of brighter values and darker values. You can have a really bright yellow or a dark yellow. And because of that, it can hinder our ability to figure out which mixes are best for depth. So, to begin, we paint the background, the entire painting, with black, white, and gray, and then once we have all of our depth in there, we're going to let it dry and then come back in and do a glazed layer and add all of our color very quickly, very simply, and not have to worry about adding that depth. At that point, we can really just focus on color. So it kind of splits the painting into two processes and allows you to spend time thinking about each individually rather than it as a large cohesive thing which may be overcomplicated and confusing. So it's great for beginners, but as someone who's been painting for a decade, I also find it incredibly useful still. So with that, that is what we are using, and now we can jump into the painting process. So we are back, we have our water, I have some Mars Black on the palette, I have some titanium white, and I'm going to begin by taking the larger flat-headed brush, which is, again, 2 centimeters wide. I'm picking this because I'm going to begin in the background here. It's a very large area of space to fill, and this is our largest brush to do so with. So, I'm going to take this, I'm going to dip the tip of it in some water, and I'm doing this to condense the bristles of the brush so I don't have any strays, and it's also going to work its way into the paint and extend the wet life of our paint. I'm going to wipe off the excess so that it's simply damp, not wet. If it's truly wet, it'll thin the paint too much and we'll have to do a lot of layers. So now that I have my brush ready, I'm going to take just a hint of titanium white with the corner of my brush and I'm going to move it over here. I'm going to make this the dark side of my palette, this the light side of my palette just for organizational sake. And now I'm going to take a good amount of Mars Black and mix that into the titanium white. Now, I used almost a relatively equal mixture, but Mars Black is a much more strong pigment, so I ended up with this very dark mixture. And I'm going to begin applying this out into the sky area. And I'm doing this predominantly in the middle. I'm not starting on the corner, I'm not starting on the edge of the earth, and I'm doing this to gauge how dark this is on the actual canvas to see if I like it like this. And then once I see that I like it, and I do, I'm going to start editing it slightly in different areas. So I want the edge of the painting to be slightly darker to give it a bit of a vignette effect to draw the eye in. The eye innately goes to the brightest portion of any painting. So I'm going to make it a little bit darker. I'm going to add a hint more Mars Black, mix that in there, just like that. And I'm going to paint this on the corner now. And I'm just going to blend it out into the rest of our applied paint. Just like this. Now, I'm starting to run out of paint, and you can see because I'm getting this toothy effect. You don't want that toothy effect. And you don't want it to be too thin either. The more you spread it, the more toothy it'll get, the more thin it will get. And you want a nice thick application. So, I'm going to go back to my palette, I'm going to mix up a little bit more of that paint, and then I'm going to come back in with a thick layer. And this will make the painting look so much better. Now, if you find that in this process you're making a lot of little, short, kind of stubby applications like this, kind of a pat and a drag, that's great for applying paint, for blending paint, but it can leave the painting looking a little choppy, which I personally like. I like that effect of paint. I like being reminded that when I'm looking at an acrylic painting that it is an acrylic painting. That said, if you want to smooth it out, do longer strokes and be very soft with the brush. The more pressure you add with your brush, the more streaks you'll end up getting. The more soft you are, the more subtle blends you'll have. So this is something we're going to continuously do, and we're going to have to do a lot of it because there is a lot of the background here. But as I get closer inwards, I'm going to make this a little bit brighter, as if the Earth is kind of emitting a little bit of light. So here I have a bit of a slightly lighter gray. It has a little bit more titanium white in it. I'm working my way relatively safely around the Earth here, just creating an edge. And I like to start with the edge because when you first apply paint to your brush, when you first have that water on it, you're going to get a much more clean, sharp application on the canvas, and as you continue to work with it, it's going to become less and less easy to use. So I like to start on the sharp lines, and then when I'm kind of done that, I move into my more open spaces like this, and I can start blending it into the rest of the background. Here I'm using soft strokes to get that nice smooth blend. Going over it a couple of times, just making sure it has a nice consistency. Sometimes when we blend, here you can see on my palette there's a little streak of white, there's some darker areas, and that can work its way onto the brush, so when you apply your paint it isn't wholly consistent, and that means you'll have to go over it a couple more times. This can be avoided by mixing your paint really well and just making sure it's consistent on the palette, but if you don't want to do that, you can just do a couple more taps on the canvas, a couple more streaks, and you can soften that out relatively well. So we're creating just a very slight gradient here, making the area closest to the Earth a little bit more of a dark gray, where this is a very, very, very dark gray. And again, we can make that edge darker by just taking some extra Mars Black and applying it there. The more layers you do, the better it'll look. And now I'm just blending it back in, creating that nice, soft line work. Now we'll continue moving in the painting and we'll get right down here. So again, starting with that slightly darker gray. Almost looks like a black, but it is a gray, and I do want it to be a gray because when we glaze on color, it'll be easier to do so. There we go. Now again, I don't want to start just blending this out. As you can see, it gets very toothy. So, I'm going to mix some more of my pigment here. And I'm continuously doing it in the same spot. That way I know that I'm mixing something consistently. And I have little bits of the original ratio kind of on the outskirts, which I'm utilizing to reference how bright or how dark it is, to see if it's too bright, to see if it's too dark. It's just helping that process. There we go. And then again, I go over it with those soft strokes at the end, these very long strokes, just to alleviate any possible brush strokes that we have in there that are kind of making it look a little too choppy. Again, I like the brush strokes, but I know not everybody does, so I'm going to make this relatively smooth in the lesson. Now here I have a slightly brighter gray. I'll begin by working my way around the Earth, because this is when we have the most smooth application, the most movable paint. Just move this up around here, and then I'll come back. Now I'm trying to mix the value with something very similar to this. It doesn't have to be exactly as bright, but it should be similar. And that seems to be where we've landed. And now for the blends. I do these short little strokes to begin with to do that initial blend, and then I do the longer strokes, the soft long strokes to make it smooth. There we go. That's nice. Now, we've done a fairly large portion here, so I'm actually going to physically stand up and take a couple of steps back and just make sure that gradient is the way I want it to be. It's incredibly subtle, But again, that is what I want. I am happy with it, and now I know I can move on. It's good to take a couple of steps back so that way you can get a clean perspective of it. Sometimes when we sit in the same space, we can kind of get this distorted view of our painting, and we don't want that. So now I'm going to hop over into this top right-hand corner. I'm going to start with that darker mixture, of course, just like this. And we'll start working that in. Just like that. Now let's make it a little bit brighter. Add a hint of titanium white. And we'll start applying this. Now this is a little bit too bright. It's arguably brighter than that, and it isn't even just on the edge. So I'm going to want to darken that again. Don't just go with the first pigment that you mix. You can edit it, you can change it, you can make it better, and that's wholly what I implore you do. Every mixture isn't going to be just right every time, and what's going to make you a great painter and great paintings is the ability to be honest about that, figure out why it isn't what you want it to be, and then fix it. There we go. Going to take a little bit of extra titanium white for this top area. I'll work this more so around the edge again. And I guess we'll connect them. There we go. Now for our soft blends, I'll do these small little choppy strokes. And then I'll work it all the way around with these longer ones. Now this area is almost essentially completely dry, but I'm still able to blend into / on top of it because my brush and my paint is so damp. It's just going to give me the ability to move new wet paint on top of dry paint and then have it semi-transparent, and as I conclude my stroke, it becomes more and more transparent as I lose paint, as it essentially just becomes water. I just drop my brush. So professional. Okay, so we'll wipe off that extra paint we have here on our brush now, and we'll get back to the painting. You know, maybe that just makes it feel a little bit more human, a little bit more fun. But there we go. Getting right back to it. Here I have my lighter gray, and we are applying that in that same manner. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering, Ryan, why did you begin painting the background first? We really want to paint the earth. That's what's really exciting. I generally advise that you start painting your backgrounds to begin with because A, they're much more simple to paint, so you get to kind of warm up. When a lot of us only get to paint once or twice a week, we don't consistently stay in practice, and we kind of need to warm up. We need to kind of reignite those fine motor skills. And painting something large and loose like a background is generally a great way to do that so that you're skilled for the foreground. It comes back relatively quickly, but sometimes it takes 20-30 minutes of painting to really get back to your peak level of ability. So I like to begin in the background, A, for that reason, but B, because generally we layer the foreground on top of the background, right? So it's much easier to paint on top of something than it is around something. And when we paint the background first, we essentially paint our foreground on top of our background, where if we're painting our foreground first, then we have to paint our background around our foreground. So it's just a much more intuitive way of going about the process. Here, getting back into those darker pigments, needs a little bit more light. Kind of just going back and forth with this. Little strokes for that blend. Once I have all of these sides blended the way I want, I'll go back in with that long stroke. And soon we'll get to have some fun and paint some stars. This is just a great warm-up because it's essentially a very basic gradient. which is depth, right? It's a light being emitted from around the Earth out into space. It's making that part of space around it just a little bit brighter. And then as we get farther out, it gets darker and darker, which is great because it also creates that vignette, which draws the eye in to our planet, our Earth. There we go. Nice and easy. Just like that. Now, what I'm going to do for this next step is begin to add some stars. And I'm going to do this by actually flinging some paint at the canvas. And this can get a little bit messy. I don't want my backdrop here to get too covered, so I'm going to put in a piece of paper, a piece of cloth, something just to protect everything else. I'd advise you do the same, and then we'll add in some stars. Okay, so we are back. I have a large piece of paper here taped to the background to protect my easel, and now I'm going to begin by taking my smaller round-headed brush. I'm going to make it extremely wet, and by the way, I cleaned my water. It's best if your water is pure for this next step, as it might dilute the white paint we're going to use. I'm going to take some of our titanium white, move it out to a clean area on the palette. Then I'm going to add a lot of water to my mixture, thinning it down to the point where it's almost like watercolor. I'm going to take my brush, hold it away from the canvas, and then just kind of peel back the bristles and launch all of these nice little speckles at it. This is a really quick, really easy way of rendering hundreds of implications on the canvas, and they're all varying sizes, which is great. We're also creating markings that are smaller than that of what we would have been able to create if we just kind of tapped them on with our brush. So the amount of stars that you incorporate will be really, truly up to you. You can have a lot of them, you can have a little bit of them, but when you're applying them, I want you to consider how far away your brush is from the painting itself, because you can hold it quite far away and you get a large application, a large spray. It'll cover a lot of space. But you could also go really close and make it much more directional, like that. So here I kind of have a cluster of stars happening instead. You can continue it, make it more dense, really fill it out if you want. It's entirely up to you. I'm going to have a couple extra stars down here and a couple more over here just to make it a little bit more interesting. You can see that there's almost a line there, which is pretty fun. But here I'm really just doing a good amount of these, giving it that proper speckled look, making sure that it has a nice detailed background. It's amazing how quickly we can take something that looked fairly mundane, simply a gradient, and make it so full of light and life. There we go. I think I'm going to leave it at that, but I'm also going to take this smaller round-headed brush, take some of that titanium white paint, and I'm now going to tap on a couple of stars. And I'm going to use a very minimal amount of pressure, because the more pressure you add with your brush, the more you expand the bristles and the larger of an application you'll end up getting. So I'm just trying to be very, very delicate, and I'm adding a couple larger stars out here in space. Do some nice ones here in this cluster, just like that. Do some in this cluster as well. There we go. And that turned out quite nice. So, for our next step here, we are actually going to start moving into the Earth itself. And for that, I don't need this backdrop, so I'm going to take that down, and then we'll continue with the painting process. So, we're back, and you are probably wondering, asking, Ryan, that looks a little bit different than what we just did. It does. It's because this is an entirely new canvas. I continued teaching the lesson, and I got about halfway through. I realized, you know what? I figured out a much better way of teaching this. So I figured I would kind of scrap the other painting, I would start again. So I just kind of redid the border here, and now we're going to get into the actual earth. And I'm going to do so, to begin here, with this larger flat-headed brush, because again we're working in a very large area and we need to create a relatively sharp edge. So before I begin, I need to allocate which value I'm going to work in here. And to do that, we need to think about where the light is coming from. What is the light? The light is the sun. Where is the light? I'm going to have it right here. So essentially it's going to be pushing light this way. Everything on this side of the earth is going to be brighter, and because this side of the earth is on the opposite side, it's going to be darker. And through that we'll create a gradient, make it look like a sphere, and create depth. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to begin by making sure that my brush is nice and damp, as we always do, and I'm going to create more of a mid-tone gray. So I'm going to take my titanium white, I'm going to move this up over here, and this is more my middle grays. This side is my lighter half of the palette, this is my darker half, this is more the middle, and I'm going to take a little bit of Mars Black and work that in there. I'm going to create a very middle of the road version here so that it's brighter than the edge, but it still has a lot of range. We can still get a lot brighter with things like our clouds. So then I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to go to the edge of the earth, and I'm going to make all of these very clean little strokes, as you can see. And this way I get a nice consistent movement around the earth. I don't lose that nice shape that I have drawn in here. And I'm only going to go to right about here, because eventually it's going to start getting darker, right? Because we're going to move into that darker side. So I'm going to go back up here, I'm going to start applying a little bit more, and just continuing to move in this general area. I'm not applying much pressure because I want it to be nice and smooth, and I want a small clean line. The more pressure you apply with your brush, the more your bristles expand, and the less of a sharp line you create. So now I'm going back and I'm taking that extra paint that I have kind of on my brush and on the edge, and I'm just starting to drag it in to the painting here. And I'm not dragging it so far that I'm getting a toothy effect, and I'm not dragging it so far that I'm kind of ripping the paint from where it initially was and moving it. I'm just moving excess paint. And if I feel that I start to run out of paint, at that point we'll go back to the palette, because again, we don't want it to be too thin in any area. So here, I'm continuing to just blend that in. You can see that there are slightly different variations of this gray, and that's because I have different variations of gray here on my brush. If you want your earth to look perfect and real and all of that, then you are going to want to blend all of that well here on your palette. That way you get a smooth application on your brush. But I actually like the brush stroke look a lot. I like to be reminded when I'm looking at a painting that it is a painting. And so I like to incorporate a little bit of that. Now here I'm using the corner of my brush to work around these very detailed areas of the continent. And then I'll just go back to these edges and I'll continue moving this inwards, as you can see here. Now, as I start to move in, it needs to start to get a little bit darker to show that light is wrapping around the earth as we want it to. So I'm going to mix up some more paint, which means I will need more titanium white, but we'll just incorporate a little bit more Mars Black this time. And I'll keep the initial mixture right here on the edge so that I know the contrast between the two values that I have. And that way I know if it's too dark or too bright, how to adjust it. And I like this. I think this is a good next step. So I start applying this right here, more so in the middle. I'm not touching this yet because I want to get most of the paint off my brush before I start blending it, otherwise this pigment will overwhelm this pigment. So I'm just kind of moving over to the right, and I'm not touching the edges of the continents with this either, because I want to go in and do that with a very clean brush stroke and pigment. So now I'm going to take some extra paint off my brush, make it nice and damp, and by making it damp it'll help me blend more easily. So now I'll just simply go over the two values that we have. work very softly, and that'll give me this nice blend. Again, I'm going to leave a couple brush strokes in there. You don't have to. And right here, well, it doesn't have a hard line, it still has a little bit of a line, so I'm going to make that a little bit brighter here. Just going to take more titanium white, continue to brighten this value, and then bring that in a little bit more. Make the blend slightly softer. There we go. That's nice. And then we'll start working it up here a little bit. This will be darkened, though, by the rest of the pigment relatively shortly. So that's a good start. Now I'm going to switch to my smallest flat-headed brush. Again, this one's 1/2 centimeter. I'm going to mix up a little bit of a darker gray, so I'll take some more Mars Black, work that in. And I'm going to run this along the sides of our continent here. And I'm going to do this by starting on the edge, because that's when I have the most clean, pristine pigment on my brush. And then I start to blend it out to the edges and into our previously applied pigments. There we go. That's good. Now we don't want to outline the edges of the continents with this dark pigment as we were doing here. It was darker there because that's the darker area of the light, right? The way it's wrapping around. But we can easily fall into a trap of just outlining this in a dark, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to grab a little bit of this brighter pigment that we had, blend that in. Just make sure that it's nice and consistent. It's not too dark. There we go. Already looking better. Now again, we don't have a hard line, but you can still see this soft change in between it, and I don't really want that. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to take the larger flat-headed brush again, and I'm just going to softly move that over. Because the paint's relatively getting drier, I am able to move over my continents a little bit and not lose that drawing. I'm just being very soft with the brush and making it work that way. Now I'm going to move onto the other side, and you know what? We'll start right in here with a bit of a slightly darker pigment than we have here because we're getting farther away from that light. So grab a hint more Mars Black, work that into our mixture, and I'll try applying that right here. And that looks quite good. Now you can use the corners of this brush, as you can see, to outline portions of your continents, but it's only going to work for so long because it will eventually run out of paint and you won't get those nice crisp lines that you want. So if you do this, instead of working with a smaller brush, make sure that you're frequently going back, getting more paint, making sure your brush is nice and damp, and it will work out quite well. There we are. Like that a lot. So from there, I'm going to incorporate a bit more of that down here. So I'm just following the edge of my continent, but again, I don't want this to be just outlining the continent here. We get into something that is a bit brighter, so I want to brighten this up. Take some extra titanium white, throw that in there. Blend it with our last mixture. And our last mixture here, it's essentially dry at this point. We're blending it into it, kind of. We're actually blending on top of it. So we're taking our pigment, and because our pigment is so wet, because it is the water interjected in it, it's actually going to move on top of the other pigment and slowly dissipate in a transparent way. So it gets more and more transparent the more we move onto this as we relieve pressure as it runs out of actual paint. And then you get a gradient because it goes from wet paint to semi-wet paint to fairly transparent to transparent, and underneath it there's that fully opaque layer. So that's what we're doing. We're not actually blending the pigments, we're layering one on top of the other and allowing it to dissipate so that it looks like there's a gradient. And the more water you have, the more thin, more smooth that application is going to be. So it's about trying to find a nice in-between of, is this too wet and therefore too transparent, or is it too dry and not giving you that smooth blend? It's about finding that nice middle area. Now I'm going to finish up this area as they're touching and they're both semi-wet right now, so it'll be easier to blend. And I'm just going to kind of create a mixture similar to that. So we'll give this a go. Going to work on the edge first. And it's a little bit bright, so you know what? I'm going to get a hint of Mars Black, work that back in here, and now we'll try this. It's a little bit darker, which is nice. It's not fully dark. We'll get a little bit more Mars Black. We'll just work that in now. And I'm trying to remember to keep this very spherical. So I'm still moving my brush strokes in that way in the end. Here I'm going over my continent a little bit, but that's okay. And now I'll move up here. So I'm going to get a little bit darker again. Grab a bit of extra Mars Black, work that in there. Be relatively careful around this next landmass. There we go. We'll just fill that in. So let's continue. Moving up there. Again, we get a little bit darker, so I'm adding a hint more Mars Black. It's never a great amount. You can tell that this is still not a very dark gray, but it gets slightly darker every time. Here I'm just working around some of these little areas. I still have a lot of clean wet paint on my brush, and you can tell because it's semi-transparent because there's a lot of water there. So I'll have to go over that again, but that's okay. Allowed me to get a nice thin layer around the edge happening. And sometimes you get this kind of ring of light around the Earth, and it's just kind of this atmospheric light that's kind of bouncing. And so you can actually make that a little bit brighter if you wanted to. I'm going to take a bit more Mars Black, a bit more titanium white. I've essentially run out of the pigment that I have here, so I have to mix up a bit more, make it a little bit darker. There we go, trying to make it fairly consistent on the palette so it's consistent on my brush. And now, just fill this in. Soft little strokes for that nice soft blend. And then long strokes that eventually lead to dropping the brush for a more smooth aesthetic. A smooth aesthetic, a less than smooth application style. Hopefully that just makes the lesson a little bit more fun for you. There we go. Blend that softly. Like that a lot. Going to take a couple of steps back because I feel like I've been working very closely to it. And when you do that, you can kind of become unaware of how the gradient's really moving, if it's large, if it's small, if you kind of have patchy areas. And by stepping back, you can get a much more honest look at the painting itself. After stepping back, I realized that the light really stretches all the way like this, and it's a little bit far for what I want. So I'm going to make this area and this area both slightly darker. So I'm going to take the gray that we've been using there, I'm going to try and applying it a little bit up here, a little bit down there. It'll be quite dark, but I'm going to make it very watery so that I'm adding it as more of a wash than as a thick, opaque layer. And we'll just do that to the top and bottom, see how it turns out. It's definitely darkening it, but I want a nice, little bit of a smoother transition, so I'll just use my finger here, do a little bit of a blend. We'll have a lot of clouds along the outskirts of the Earth, so it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. I'm not too concerned about it. I just want to get a slightly different movement here. And I know the Earth on video looks a little bit less than a perfect circle, but that's really because there's a little bit of a bend in my canvas. It kind of dips, and because of that, when you look at it from a different angle, it kind of gives this impression that it isn't this proper shape, but it is from most angles. And that's something to consider while you're painting. If you feel like it's not perfectly round, consider getting up, moving around, seeing if it actually is something you need to fix, or if it's something that just looks that way because of the angle, because the canvas might have a dip or impression in it. There we go. I'm going to stand up again. You know what? I like that. I think that's good. This is a little bit messy in application. I'm okay with that right now because, again, I do intend to apply a lot of clouds. And clouds are a great way of kind of remedying any unsmooth blends that you might have or areas that you don't entirely love. It's really nice that we have this kind of safeguard in the subject. And I'll use that, I'll keep that the way it is, and I'll use it as an example of how we do just that. So we've essentially added the water to our Earth. It now looks like it's three-dimensional. The light is moving around it. We have a light side, we have a dark side. All of that's going really well. And now it's time to start moving into our continents. And I'm going to do that by beginning by taking my medium-sized flat-headed brush. It is 1 centimeter wide. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and damp. And then I'm going to take a gray that's kind of like this, and I'm going to start working that in for my continent. That way it stands out on the edges because it'll be a slightly lighter pigment against these darker values. And we'll also augment it slightly as we go. That way we can incorporate texture and varying geography into it. So I'm going to begin by just taking this. That's a little bit too dark. We'll try lightening it, add some titanium white. Try that, and we can even throw it in here and test it. And if we don't really like it, if it doesn't work, then again we can cover that up with clouds, but it's a good way of testing the value. It was still a little bit dark, so I'm taking more titanium white, working that in. I'll test that right there. And that's much more close. It's a little bit bright, but you know what? That'll actually work really well. So I'm going to take this now, and I'm just going to start applying it. I'm applying it in the middle, but what I really should be doing is applying it on the edge, because again, when you first mix your paint, you have a relatively clean brush, you have a bit of extra water on that, you're going to be able to create the most smooth lines. So working on the edges initially is really the smart idea, and then when you start to run out of paint, or you don't feel like you can get those smooth edges, start working it into your continent from there. Now, I'm going to go back, grab a little bit more, make sure that it's nice and consistent on my brush, and I'll continue working down here, just like that. This brush is great because it's covering all of this space relatively quickly, but I still have those nice sharp edges which are helping me define this well. Now as I get over here, it's important to note that that light isn't just affecting the water, it's also affecting the land to a point. So as I get over here, I'm going to make it a little bit darker. We're moving to the darker side of the earth, and we're going to change that value accordingly. There we go. And now we have two values, and I can start blending them together, but I'm going to do a lot of that with this kind of tapping motion with my brush. I'm going to do a tap and then a drag in different areas, and I'm just trying to create lots of inconsistencies that look like inconsistencies in the geography. I don't want it to all look the same. We want some areas to be darker, some areas to be lighter. I'm going to again make this side predominantly a little bit darker. Do a little bit of a tap here. It's fun. You know, we'll grab some more. We'll move it down here. I'm going to keep the edges over here a little bit lighter though, because generally the outskirts of a landmass are a little bit brighter just because that's where it's a very densely populated area, and that's where light is going to be emitting from. Now, it's not to say that the entire coastline here is going to be heavily populated. That would take a great deal of research, but it's a good general rule to work with. Here I'm really darkening this area. It's getting fairly close to that right there. It's okay to have similar values. They will be done in different colors, and it will stand out more so a little bit later on. If you find you add too much of that darker pigment, you can just mix up a little bit of that lighter pigment again. Work that in. You can soften things with more of a drag effect than a tap effect. And just work it until you have something that you are happy and proud of. I might come back and work on that a little bit. It's easier to build texture when you're painting dry layers or wet layers on top of dry layers rather than wet layers into wet layers. Right now this is all very wet, so getting a lot of texture is difficult. If we let that dry for 3 or 4 minutes, it'll be much easier. So I'm going to move up into the top here, and this I'm going to make fairly bright. So take some titanium white, mix that about. It's a little bit darker than I wanted, so I'll grab some extra titanium white. Again, it's all about trial and error, figuring out what pigments to use, not worrying too much about it, applying something, and if it doesn't work, hey, you know what, that's alright. We can always try again. We can always change it and amalgamate it. I know that an issue I had when I started painting was I was too cautious. I was afraid that I'd get the pigment wrong, the value wrong, so I just wouldn't apply the paint. I'd be very slow with painting. And then I realized that, you know what, especially with acrylics, it's so easy to fix. It doesn't take much time for it to dry. Just apply the paint and learn the lesson from it. Sometimes you'll learn that you applied too much paint, or too dark paint, too light paint, same goes with color, but you'll learn to edit and change it so much more quickly if you are consistently painting and just getting it on there. There we go. I actually painted all of these continents in the first version, but you know what, I redid it because I had this better idea, and you know what, I think that was worth it, right? If I had taken my time, if I had been really slow with it, I might not have time today to go back and do the second version. But because I took my time, or I didn't take too much time rather, I'm able to do this. I do think it's important that we take enough time to do a good job to think about what we're doing for the most part, but don't second guess yourself too much. Get some paint on there, and if you find you're having issues, that's okay. Just work to correct them. Here I'm making the outskirts, the edges a little bit brighter, just like that. Tap in a little bit of texture. There we go. If some of my continents or land masses are a little bit off, I'm okay with that. I don't need it to be absolutely perfect. I just want it to be relatively close. We are working on a fairly small canvas. It isn't that large of an area to introduce too much detail, and if you incorporate too much detail too quickly, it can look a little bit overdone, and you really find realism when you learn to simplify things. If you walk into the most complicated room in the world with the most detail, the most color, but the lights are off, you're not going to see any of that detail. So it's important to recognize when to paint detail and when not to. Sometimes it's best not to. If you want to paint a really nice landscape with a brilliant tree in the foreground, if you paint the background with an incredibly detailed application, you're not going to have a lot of focus on that beautiful tree in the foreground. So you might want to soften the background, you might want to make it less detailed, work with more round-headed brushes, make it more soft rather than these hard aesthetics that'll detract. So it's recognizing where to put that detail and where not to. And here, I'm just trying to find that happy balance in these and just make sure I'm adding enough to make it look natural, but not too much to the point where it's distracting or seems improper. Here I'm going back in and I'm adding a little bit of extra texture and highlight. Remember, I wanted to let this dry. I did. And now we're just heading back in. There we go. All is well. Like that a lot. Now the next step of the painting is not to add clouds, but to start adding color. Because I want to add the clouds on top of the color, as if we did the clouds now, they would adopt a lot of color. So what we're going to do, we're going to let this dry entirely. I know it doesn't really look like the earth yet. Clouds and the different colors and different land masses we add in later on will make a big, big difference. But for now, this is actually quite good. This is what we want, and this will get us to where we need to go. We need to allow it to be oversimplified, to look a little bit bland for this portion, and we'll add all of that detail relatively soon. But right now, I'm going to clean my brushes really well. I'm going to clean my water. I'm going to clean my palette, and then I'm going to come back in and we're going to start glazing with lots of colors. I will list all of the colors in the description, but we will also talk about them in just a second. And we'll also talk about what glazing is for those of you who are kind of new. It's a fantastic, fantastic technique for adding color, and we'll be able to have a lot of fun with it. So I'm going to take 10 to 15 minute break, let that dry fully. It needs to be incredibly 100% completely dry, and then we'll jump back into it and have some fun. And I do mean some fun. So let's do that. I will see you in just a minute. You know what? I said that. What's really important before you start glazing is take a step back and make sure that your painting is exactly the way you want to. I have this little area down here. It's a little bit darker than I want. I do want to fix that. So I'm just going to grab a bit of this lighter gray and work it back up. I'm going to take a couple of steps back, see how it looks. You know what, that's starting to look a lot better. I'm going to continue it. I'm going to take some steps back, and you know what, again, it looks better. And you know why this is happening? Because as I was talking about, there can be this reflective light that's kind of around the Earth because you have the light reflecting off the atmosphere. So I'm just continuing to add this very, not bright, but lighter gray to the edges. And it's giving it that effect. Being very soft with my application, making it nice and thin here. And you can even have it back over here again. I know we darkened this area, but you know what? It's okay to rework it a couple times. Just be honest with yourself and make it the way you want to. Can even throw that over the land a little bit. That is so much better. Glad we did that. I'm going to grab a little bit more. Work it around this area of water again. Just along the edge. I'm not blending it in. Smoothing it out a little bit. There we go. Okay, now we're actually going to take a 10-15 minute break, let it dry, and we can start glazing from there. So we are back. The canvas is entirely now dry to the touch, which it does need to be for this next process. I have some clean water, my brushes are clean, and I have a variety of paints here on the palette. And that's because we are moving into the glazing stage. And for those of you who are unaware with the process, glazing is when you take a very, very thin pigment and layer it on top a previously dried thick pigment. So here we are simply going to paint on top of this with very thin paints. We're going to make them very thin in one of two ways. One, we can go out and we can purchase an actual medium to do so, or two, we can utilize our water. I personally like to use water because it's something we use in all other aspects of painting, and the more we use it, the better we'll get at using it, and it'll just continuously become a more useful part of the process. It's also great because it's incredibly cost effective, right? So that's what I'm going to be using. I'm going to thin these down to the point where they are almost like watercolors, and then I'm going to apply these very thin layers. The more we add to it, the more vibrant our layers are going to become, but we'll do it slowly and work our way up. So I'm going to begin here with this larger flat-headed brush that I've been using. I like this because it does have that nice consistent edge and it can carry a lot of paint. I'm going to begin by tipping this into the water, as we generally do, just kind of wiping off that excess paint. Then I'm going to do the earth first, and I'm going to do that way I know how vibrant I can make the space. If I started with the background and the space and I made it too vibrant, then I'd have to make the earth increasingly more vibrant, and I don't want to do that. I want to make the earth exactly how I want it specifically, then I'll go back and I'll do the background. So we're working in a more counterintuitive way with this, but it's good to show you that there are exceptions to every rule. So I'm going to begin by working in the land masses here. And I want this to be fairly green. Now I don't have any greens on my palette, so let's talk about our colors and what we intend to do. Here I have a titanium white. This is a primary yellow. This is a cadmium yellow deep hue. Here we have in French ultramarine. This is a burnt sienna, burnt umber, primary red, and Mars black. Now I don't have a green, so I'm going to mix it. I'm going to take some of this French ultramarine blue. I'll move that out here on my palette. I'm only using the corner of my brush to grab it because I don't want to dilute the entirety of the brush and move that blue into another pigment. Then I'm going to take some of this primary yellow here, and I'm going to mix those two together. And as you can see, they mix to make a really nice green. Now this is too thick to apply to the canvas as it is. It'll start disrupting the values. I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to dip my brush in my water. I'm going to apply that water into our mixture here, make it nice and thin. You can see that it's turning into more of what you would assume to be a watercolor consistency than an acrylic. And then I'll start painting that in here. Now before, we wanted to avoid having two different colors or a white and a black on either side of our brush, but here it can be kind of nice as it makes things a little bit more inconsistent. When you're painting with washes, you lose a little bit of control. It's like watercolor. It kind of bleeds in different areas. It can start to drip a little bit, but that's really a big part of the beauty of it. It's much more natural. It's a really loose way to paint, and it can create these really beautiful effects that you wouldn't think to do, and these beautiful mixes that you wouldn't think to do. So I'm essentially beginning here by just applying some of this green paint to our landscape. And I'm following the reference photo slightly, but not exactly. Now I'm going to grab some brown. I'm going to take some of my burnt sienna, my burnt umber. I'm going to mix those two together. Going to make them incredibly thin in the same way. And then I'll work that down here. And again, it will probably start to drip, especially in my initial applications because it'll be very watery. But then I can blend it into the green very nicely. Look at that. Now if it starts to drip, you can stop it if you'd like, or you can let it continue. Some people really like that extra effect it gives it. I do in some scenarios, I don't in others. Here you can see that I'm just moving that paint around the border, moving it out. There I can kind of clean it up with a very wet brush, move it back into that edge or out off of the canvas. But when you paint like this, you do accept that you again lose a little bit of control, which I'm happy to do in these scenarios. I think we come up with a really nice painting because of it. So look at all of the different texture and interest this already has in it. It's because we did that base layer with that more choppy application, and now we have this very loose application of color on top. By the way, I'm using the burnt or the, raw sienna, the burnt sienna here, because it has a little bit more red in it than a regular brown, and it'll just make this a bit warmer. There we go. Still using the edge of this brush to deliver those nice sharp lines. Grab some more green for up here. Just kind of blend them together however we will. Some areas will remain much more green. And I'll mix up a bit more. But make sure when you mix those new paints to add that extra water. That way it doesn't become too thick. There we go. You can even do a little bit of a tap motion to instigate little pooling areas, and those pooling areas will create extra texture as it dries, make it a little bit more interesting than it already was. Here I'm just moving it back down into this, and I'm starting to try to get farther and farther away from my painting as I'm painting here, just to give myself a bit more of an honest view of it. Now here you can see that this is starting to bleed down again, so I'll clean that up, just like that. And I will take truly a couple of steps back and see how it's turning out and what I want to do with it moving forward here. So far, it's going really well, but I do want a bit more green right in there. So I'll take that and I'll just start applying it. I'll also take some of this cadmium yellow deep hue to make a slightly warmer, more olivey green. Just like that. You can see there's a fairly big difference. This will just instigate some additional diversity in the painting, which is not a bad thing at all. There we go. Now I'm also going to throw a little bit up over here because we did have that other landmass that kind of gets lost in the shadow of the earth. So we can just throw that in there, nice and easy. Doesn't take much extra work. Make it fairly green with just hints of the brown. And now I'll add another application of some of that brown down here. Remember, the more layers you add, the more saturated you can make it become. And we just do it in stages. We apply a little bit here, a little bit there, we build it up until we get exactly what we want. Take our time, we work through the process. There we go. So that's going fairly well. Before we add any more color to it, we essentially need to let that dry fairly well. Otherwise it'll just become too wet, too drippy, and things won't really work together. So I'm going to take a break from that and I'm going to start moving into the water. So for that, I'm just going to take some of this pure French ultramarine blue, French Ultramarine blue, it's a little bit more of a warm blue. It has hints of red in it. So if you have a primary blue and a primary red, just throw a little bit of red into your primary blue, and I do mean just a hint, and you'll get this. Now I have a little bit of green on my brush because I've been working with the green water. If you don't want that, you can clean your brush, clean your water, and you'll have a perfectly new color. However, I am working it in a little bit. I'm not too worried because, again, this does lean to be a bit warmer, and the green will just kind of cancel out the red a little bit. So from there, I'm going to start applying my blue, as you can see, in the water. And you can actually see hints of the green in there. So now you need to make a decision. Before you continue, do you take out that green? Do you continue with it? After seeing it, you know what, I think I am going to take it out. I'm going to clean my water, I'm going to clean my brush, and then I'll be right back. In the meantime, I'll just take a little bit of this off. I'm going to try to be back before it dries though. That way I can continue working with this and it doesn't change the value at all. So we are back. I have a clean brush, I have clean water, and I'm actually going to take the blue and I'm going to move it into a new area just because that is slightly diluted with the greens and the yellows. So I'm just going to mix up this nice watercolor-esque blue, and then I'll throw that around the edge here. Now again, if you don't want any brush strokes, make these large sweeping motions, but I'm okay with a little bit of that. I do like it, I think it looks nice. So I'm going to be a little bit more choppy, and then if I want to smooth it out, I have a good amount of time to do that, because it's so wet and it'll take quite some time to dry. There we go. Work that back around the continent. I'm just using the small corner of the brush to get those detailed areas. And right now it does look a little bit choppy, a little bit wet. You can kind of see it bubbling. That's okay. I'm just going to keep moving it about as it starts to dry. I'm not worried about it at all. Then here I'm moving around my coast. I'm kind of going over the landmass a little bit, just having that water work its way up. There we go. I'm going to take a hint of titanium white and move that into our blue, make a slightly brighter blue to do a wash with. Still going to make it very thin, very wet, but I'm just going to apply this around the edge now. There we go. That's nice. Just continue blending that in. You can see that it's getting darker and darker because the values underneath are darker. It's all working as it's supposed to. And then if I took this and I applied it over here, you can see that it's much brighter than the blue that we had without the titanium white. So you can still augment these colors to be brighter or darker. Just recognize that titanium white is an innately fairly thick pigment. So you'll need to use a little bit more water to thin down that mixture that has it. Here I'm using a little bit of it. And now we'll go back to the pure French Ultramarine blue. So we get into the really dark side. Work around my other continent. And blend these nicely. There we go. All coming along well. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back, see how it's turning out. And that looks like we have some nice color. Good. Again, it's very simplified at this point. The clouds will do so much for this painting. We're just not quite there yet. What I want to do is I want to continue to highlight this edge just a little bit. And I'm going to just take a little bit more of that blue and that white and work that on. There we go. It's a really good start. Now I'm going to go back in and touch up the edges of my land now that it's had a bit of a chance to dry. Use the corner again for this. Add some extra texture and detail in there. Just amalgamating those colors, making them a little bit more interesting. You can even make more of a lush green by using much more yellow. There we go. Looks quite nice. I'll add a hint of it over here. Like that a lot. Add a little bit more brown. Now because we've went back to the green, we should probably clean our brush and our water again before we intend on re-entering the water area. Just something to consider. Now, I'm fairly happy with this layer that we have. I'm going to let all of this dry really well. And then I'm going to come back in, add my clouds, and then we can continue doing some extra glazing after that. But the next the next step of this process is a really fun one. So, I'll be right back. In your time, about 3 seconds. In my time, about 15 minutes. I'm going to clean my water, brushes, all of that. It's been a couple of minutes, and it's not fully dry, but as I stepped back, as I looked at it, as I thought about it, I said, you know what, I think this looks a little bit more bright than I want it to. And we can change that quite simply. So I figured I'd show you, before we started on the clouds, how we do that. So I have my blue here. I'm going to take some of that. I'm going to move it out into this area of just French ultramarine blue. I'm going to take a hint, and I do mean a hint of Mars black. I'm going to work those two together like that. I'm going to add some extra water, make it very thin, and this is going to change the value. It's dark to the point where it is going to augment it, but I want to. So it's great that you can still change that value even when you started working with color, which is another important part of these lessons. So here I'm just working with this much darker blue here, applying it on that dark side of the planet. There we go. Working my way around those land masses, and then I'll start to blend it forward in the painting as well. Have to start here because it's going to work through this, not simply around it. By having these brighter and darker values, it'll make everything pop and stand out much more. If everything was bright, like it kind of was before I started this process, then it wouldn't have a lot of contrast, and it wouldn't be as eye-catching. So here we go, just kind of softening some of my strokes, but I do want a couple of them to show through because, as you know, that's just the look I prefer in paintings. These longer strokes are great at kind of evening things out though if you want to. There we go. I'll take a couple steps back, see how I like that. And you know what? That already has so much more depth. I'm going to move around the room. That is very close to what I want. I'm going to take just a little bit more, add it right here, blend it out, blend it down. And here you can see that it's getting a little bit brighter, and that's because I've added so much water that it started to strip away the paint in that area. This only happened when it's really wet, and we can remedy it by using a bit of a more thick pigment. So I'm going to take some of that Mars Black, French Ultramarine Blue. I'll grab a hint of Titanium White because we'll need to reestablish a little bit of the value. And then I'll apply it on top. Using significantly less water, I'm almost just repainting the area with actual thick paint. There we go. It's fairly easy to repaint because we were already working with all of these great colors. Knew what we were using. It's easy to rematch and refind. There we go. You know what, I think I'll make this even a little bit darker. Having a lot of fun here. I like this extra contrast when we add in the clouds. It'll really stand out nicely. I'm not using as much water right now because it's all so wet. I don't want to strip away that paint to any great degree. I think that's enough of a darker color, so I'll wipe off the excess and then I'll just blend this out. There we go. Now when we add all of those darker pigments to the water, it only makes sense that we add a little bit of it to some of the land as well. So I'll just throw this on. My brush is really wet for this portion. I don't want to be painting it on. I just want to be glazing it on right here. Take a little bit more. There we go. Just has a little bit more depth now. That will look great with some clouds. I'm really excited about it now. Going to take a couple of steps back, move around the room. It's almost slightly more simplified with that last darker application, but it'll make the clouds pop to the point where it'll make it much more interesting. So it's one of those things where you sacrifice detail in one area for another, and I think it'll turn out really well. So with that said, now I'm actually going to just let it dry, and then we'll come back to it in 15 to 20, cleaning my water and my brushes yet again. So this is entirely dry, and we can start moving on to the next part of the process, which is adding in the clouds and a lot of detail. So for this, I'm going to take the smallest round-headed brush because it's going to give me a very soft edge for these applications, which is great for things like clouds. Now I'm going to begin, as we generally do, by making the tip of it nice and wet. I'm going to grab some of my titanium white, move it out to a clean, clear spot on my palette. I'm going to make it nice and wet again, because the more wet it is, the more transparent it'll be, and it'll be really nice to have some transparent clouds in our landscape here. So let's start off with something fairly easy, and that's just a simple wispy cloud. It's going to be quite large. I'm going to create a fairly organic shape here, as you can see, and then I'm going to do lots of little taps here to create some little extra pieces of cloud that are kind of breaking off and finding their way into the sky over the ocean. And you can create patterns with them. So here I'll create a couple little spin-offs, and they'll have little spin-offs of their own. And we have our first cloud. Now it exists entirely out in the middle of the ocean. Let's do one that connects both the ocean to the land, and this will show that they're really on top. So here I'm working it with little taps, and I try not to do consistent strokes because I find little taps helps me make it more inconsistent. You want these to be very randomized and interesting. You don't want two clouds to ever look the same. So here we're just working on them that way, and as I start to run out of paint, I get a much more thin application, which looks like a very transparent set of clouds, which is actually great, because not all clouds are extremely dense, right? So here, I have some extra thin clouds right next to these more pronounced clouds. Now, let's do something fun. Let's add a swirl of clouds. So I'll head back up here. I'll start in the center. I'll start to move my way around, create kind of this big storm. There we go. This is great because it's a very original formation that we won't have really anywhere else in the painting. It's distinctive, and it'll make it interesting. Just like that. You can also thin areas by just adding a lot of extra water. And here I just move it out like that. Very simple. I can also go back in and thicken areas by adding extra paint to the more dominant areas. Now let's continue. So I'm going to take some extra titanium white. Going to find maybe a spin-off area that I could have. Want a little bit more water on my brush. Let's say it starts to move down like this. And maybe it even connects into the other one. When they start connecting, it gets much more interesting. Now I'm going to do a lot of little taps like we did before, just to show all of these kind of little break-off points. A lot of them are going to be fairly transparent, which is nice. Going to give it that extra effect. And then let's start leaning towards this outer area of the Earth. So you know what, I'll create a little bit of a line here, as if the cloud is wrapping its way around, and then I'll bring it back in. And then I'll move it over the land. This way, it looks like the Earth is three-dimensional in this cloud, and that the cloud moves on top of both water and land, again, establishing its depth. So there are lots of different ways to make these really interesting. And you know what, we'll do a nice big one right up here. You can see just how thick that pigment is right there. So I'm just going to take off the paint that I have, grab some water, and I'll thin this out here. And then we'll move it up. Part of that green's showing through because the clouds are so thin, but that's not a bad thing. I'll go back in and I'll thicken the middle of the cloud, but I'll leave the edges to be a little bit more transparent. And we'll run this around the edge and bring it back in a couple areas. Here I'm just being very loose with my brush to create an original, interesting application. And I'm also moving over here as I start to run out of paint because I want it to be more transparent so those darker pigments really show through, and it makes it look like there's even a shadow on the clouds and like the clouds aren't receiving light. So now we'll head down here and we'll create a really neat larger formation. So I'll start kind of a movement like that. I'll create a second one, give it a kind of a break off there, give it a little bit of a pattern up here, like that. Kind of soften these, have them work their way out a little bit. And you can really see where the detail in the earth that we were kind of emitting earlier is now coming from. Now we really have this opportunity to create something interesting. But had we made the Earth too complicated before, this would look overdone. But this is really that beautiful touch to it that just makes it so much more interesting. So I wanted to do a lot of it. So I need to make the rest of it, again, fairly simple. Trying to connect a fair number of these clouds to the outskirts of the Earth. There we go. Let's move back inland for a little bit. Let's create another neat little piece here. Kind of connects to that one. And we don't have anything over here, so let's create another interesting shape. Kind of make it a little bit of a swirl like this, but not to that same extent. And now I'm starting to run out of paint, which is great because we're getting to that darker side of the canvas. There we go. Let's do a lot more in here. I don't want it to be too open. So I'll take this, make a nice dominant cloud right there. Kind of start connecting these into this. Make it look like there's a pattern, things are consistent, things are working together, they're touching, they're amalgamating. Here I'll do a little bit of a tap for these, kind of breaking off. It's quite thick right there, so I'm going to just take a wet brush, thin it out a little bit. Much better. That looks good. There we go. Going to take a couple of steps back and just see how far we've come, what we still need to do, some areas that might be lacking or need more. Just going to give us a much more honest perspective back here. I think I want more cloud in this area, but I want it to be very thin so that it looks a bit darker. So I start with this very watery mixture, as you can see. And then I'll start to move it out, and as I move it out more, it becomes more and more thin. So it gets that nice dark backing that we have. There we go. Now we'll add a little bit of thickness into the areas that are starting to move into the light. So these right here. And then I'll add a little bit more back in here, but not too much. You can kind of connect it with this one. And we'll make it into a bigger cloud. It won't be as bright, but we can make it interesting by changing the size. We don't want them all to be too small. We can make some quite large. Let's do a larger one over on this side as well. We're going to take a pre-existing one that we have, kind of build it out a little bit. I like it a lot. I think that it has a lot of opportunity, and I think that we can build this one out as well. There we go. Continuously brightening some of them that are closest to the light. If you find that your earth isn't as much of a circle as you'd like, you can also just kind of extend areas of it with clouds. Again, it's that subject that really fixes everything in the painting. If you have an area with an inconsistent blend, you can put clouds on top of it. If you have an area with color you don't really love, you can put clouds over top of it. You just have so much option. And it's a wonderful thing. I want to do a couple more little tapped clouds in the same way we did these. I think those turned out really nice. We have a lot of wispy ones down here, but we don't have a lot of tapped ones. It's important to incorporate different kinds. It'll make it so much more interesting. See how it's all just kind of building and layering and turning into the painting we all knew it could be. Took a little while, but that's okay. I think we're all having fun painting because we like it. Going to take another couple of steps back, give it a good evaluation again, see what we can do with it. Something that's kind of been consistently bothering me through this is that at the angle it's at, with the painting at the angle it's at, it kind of looks elongated, and I don't want it to look that way. In real life, it looks like a circle, but because of the view, it doesn't for you. And I recognize that this isn't about creating the best painting I can, it's about creating the best lesson for you to create the best painting you can. So, I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make my planet a little bit less circular. I'm going to take the medium-sized flat-headed brush, take some titanium white. I'm just going to extend the edge this way, and hopefully on camera it looks a little bit more natural. There we go. It's going to look like there are just kind of clouds along the side, and this is a good way to just show you as well that, again, if you don't like the shape, this is a very easy way of changing it. You can also add clouds kind of coming off the planet slightly along the edges. It's kind of a neat effect. There we go. Clouds exist in different height levels in the sky, and we can show that. Okay, so I've extended it. Now I'm going to check the viewfinder and see if it looks a little bit more natural on camera. And you know what? I think it does. That worked out well. Okay, glad we did that. Now I'm going to go back to the smaller round-headed brush. I'm going to take a little bit more titanium white, brighten this slightly. I want a little bit more of a bright cloud in here, so I think I'm going to extend this one out like that, and then just have it dissipate as we move over there. Taking a couple of steps back, seeing how it turns out, like that. I think I'll add a little bit more here. Getting fairly abstract with my shape at this point. And a little bit more of a highlight here in the middle. Just like that. There we go. I think I'll add a little bit more over here. See how that looks? It's still fairly wet, so if I don't like it, I can take it off. I do like it though. There we are. Now I think I'm pretty happy with the earth as it is. I'm going to do a little bit more glazing along the outside of space. So I'm going to take the larger flat-headed brush, take some of that ultramarine blue, move it out to a nice new spot here on the palette, make it nice and wet, and then I'll just throw this over a lot of these stars in the background here. I'm going to have it very thin. I don't want to add a very blue background space. I want it to be nice and subtle. So we're using a lot of water, and I'm not going to do much layering at all. Being fairly careful around my planet itself. And I'm also kind of just jumping around, whatever feels natural. Here we're really just doing more of the same. But it's great that we did this at the end because my natural inclination probably would have been to make this much more vibrant than I am. And I definitely decided subtlety was the way to go here. Now you can even take a little bit of this blue and move it back over the earth and some of the clouds along the edges. It'll kind of put it a little bit farther back in space. And by going over the slightly more cloud-covered edges here, we bring more attention to the middle of the painting because the eye will innately go to the brightest point, and by adding this blue, we kind of tone down the value of the white on the edges, so what's left in the middle is really what stands out. We can also take a hint of red, move that into our ultramarine blue, make a little bit of a purple, and throw that into the background as well as a nice little touch, hint of warmth. There we go. I like that a lot. It's incredibly subtle, but it makes a difference. Now that I did all of that glazing, just going to head back in with the smaller round-headed brush, do a little bit more highlights on the clouds that I really do want to pop now that I made some of them slightly more subdued. And we'll just bring that attention really into the center here. Stepping back, going to kind of move around the room and see what I think. Sorry about that, I just checked and it seemed like the mic cut out for that last clip. So essentially what I was doing, I was just adding a little bit more blue to, again, draw the eye in towards the middle, which has less of that blue. Now the last thing I'm going to do is pretty extreme. I'm going to extend the space to overlap the bottom of the Earth just a little bit. So I'm going to take a hint of titanium white, move that over here. I'm going to grab about an equal amount of Mars black, make it nice and dark, hint more titanium white. And I essentially want to recreate the gray that's along the outskirts here, but I'm also going to add in a hint of blue this time so that it all kind of blends together. There we go. Now, I'm going to hope it's the right value and just kind of cover up the bottom a little bit. Again, continue to play with that shape. I just want to show you that you can always kind of go back to it, change it up. You don't have to worry too much. It's a wonderful thing about acrylics. It's all just so malleable. There we go. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a tap. Just get rid of those new brush strokes. Maybe we'll get a little bit of a starry effect with it. And now I'm going to take a couple of steps back. So anyways, there we have it. That is today's hour, but probably closer to 2 hour long painting lesson. For our first longer space scene, I think this turned out really, really well. I'm quite excited about it, and now the potential for future space scenes as well. If you are new to the channel, I do post these hour-long lessons up here on the channel each and every Saturday, so consider subscribing and hitting the bell button. That way you're notified when I do upload these. If you would like to say thank you and support the channel, you can do so up over on Patreon, where of course you can get a back catalog of over 50 bonus hour-long lessons, access to our Facebook group, options to vote on future lessons, and traceables for things just like this, including, again, the clouds and all of the more complicated pieces. But with that said, thank you so much for joining me. This was truly a pleasure, and I really look forward to what we come up with next. So, I will see you very soon with a brand new hour-long lesson. And for those of you who are up at the Alpine level on Patreon, remember to post your work in the Facebook group. I can't wait to see it. Anyways, I will see you very soon. Again, new lesson. And as per usual, as always, above all, stay creative.